Okay, there. This is our last class. It's the 14th session. The theme technically is Statecraft today. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the previous class on some aspects of it. We talked about crisis management. We talked about some aspects of judgment and aspects of crisis management. We talked about how decision makers are doing it, normal operation versus crisis management, and then the question of the three characteristics things of judgment, visions, and nerve, and the problem of lacking when you have leaders or decision makers who lack these characteristics, as the line says, ordinary problems balloon into crises. The difference between ordinary time and crises is a very important thing. And the danger here is you don't want to run everything. You don't want everything. This is a problem. Crisis should not be ordinary. In other words, it shouldn't be every day a crisis. If every day is a crisis and you're running everything as crisis management 24/7, then you're doing things wrong. This is not the way you should be running it. Now, I know there's a lot of popular TV because if you look at the stories about, watch movies and things like this, or TV shows about the presidency, or things like the current one, the old one from the 2000s. The late 90s, 2000s was West Wing. Then they have The Veep, right? The Veep is a comedy show, which is very badly done for the purpose of the director of the series, the producer director of the series of Veep, is a British, an Italian-sounding name, but a British director, a British scene maker, famous for his comedies. Particularly in the very famous British comedy In the Thick of It. And he also made a movie called In the Loop, about the invasion of Iraq. Okay. The problem with In the Loop was that his understanding of the British system is fantastic. He understands the nature of the Blairite system and how the Blairite structure changed the nature of government. And in fact, there was a wonderful BBC series called In the Thick of It. And I would recommend people to watch In the Thick of It to understand the way British government evolved. You watch two British series and you understand the evolution of the British political system. The 1980s BBC the comedy series Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, It was late 1970s, very early 80s. Okay, the series, both series were done, and it perfectly captured the nature of British cabinet government and the way the parliamentary cabinet structure operated, and the role of ministers, the fight between the ministers and the civil service, and how the civil service saw themselves. And what is the civil service? The new word, we have a new word, there's a word thrown about around called the deep state, right? We have this talk, people talking about deep state. Well, what the deep state was is in one sense, it's basically the security branches of the permanent bureaucracy. The military, security services, intelligence services. This is what, this is a term from the radical left from the 1960s, okay? The deep state argument is that the radical left position was, you couldn't, once Obama ran, I'm going to shut down Gitmo, I'm going to stop all this stuff. And then when he becomes president, what happens? He continues the Bush policies. In fact, he actually engages in more assassination through drones and through the special forces than even, in other words, the nature of what happened after when Obama took over the presidency. He just basically turned the American special forces into assassination squads, and expanded drones as a mechanism to engage, and also using drones. The Bush era used drones very rarely for kind of launching weapons off. It was it was during the Obama administration that drones became a very useful instrument to then assassinate people, kill people. Okay, so therefore the arming of drones, for weaponization of drones for the purpose. The original drones were mostly reconnaissance and information gathering, and only extremely rarely maybe dropping a bomb on something of very high, in other words, a high-risk target. And in other words, a very high-risk target that if a human plane came into, they'd most likely be shot down or killed. In other words, so therefore they had the minimalist exception for drones for warfare, where the Obama administration expanded drone warfare dramatically. So why is I mentioning this? Because this is the conception of well, see, Obama wasn't really running things, the argument goes. It's the deep state, the permanent bureaucracy. Now, watching the BBC series, you'll understand that. Why? Because the civil service sees itself, the permanent bureaucracy sees itself as the true government. And this was the thing. Now, in the early thousands, I can't say it's Ilucci. He has this Italian-sounding name. He created a series in the thick of it, and this is presenting the Blairite government, where all power is in the Prime Minister's office and in the media, the people who control media, and they will basically torture the ministers. That they will, in other words, and what happened to the civil servants, the quality of the civil servants completely changed. The civil servants used to have lots of power. Now the civil servants are basically, what? I mean, it's the multicultural array. What used to be the civil service were the elites, all the elites from Harrow, the public school system, the British public school system, who went to Oxford, Cambridge, who were classics majors. Okay, they distrusted any specialists. So none of the ministries had specialists running them. They had the old boy network running it. Okay, this was the permanent civil service. It was that thing. By the time of Blair, this is destroyed. That's all been replaced by the multicultural phase. So who started going to Oxford and Cambridge? It started to be, well, no longer the kids at Harrow's, but this becomes, it becomes the new Britain, and therefore you get a lot of different faces, multicultural, women. And the problem with this is that they have none of the substance or strengths of the old thing, and therefore they're easily ignorable. They're easily manipulable, easily ignorable, and they're easily bullied. And therefore, the spin masters control this. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because I think this is a classic case of misunderstanding the reality of what happens to a political system in that sense, that changed over time. And that this is the problem. And therefore, from a spin director thing, crisis is great. Crisis is great because why? It requires that they have to micromanage everything. In other words, everything is on intensity 10 and intensity 11. Now that's disastrous. In other words, running a government on that kind of structure is a complete failure. You would never be able to do it. It wouldn't work. It would be a crisis mode all the time. You're tweaking every single minister's word to make sure they don't contradict the cabinet's policy. And if they do say something or there's a scandal, you attack the media. You in other words, you leak. The government itself is the leaking agent for the most part. In order to control the media, to direct the media on issues the way they want to, and then when a media source is going in a direction you don't really want them, you feed other sources, you feed other media more scandalous stuff to get attention off of it. You create scandal and you create control of the information space. That is the nature of modern political spin media, controlling information, controlling narrative. The way the narrative operates. What is the narrative? What is the story? What is the thing that's going to grow? And by the way, you're the easiest group of people to manipulate. Why? Because your world it's worse than Plato's cave. You live in a world of these things. And the nature of this information, because it's individualized and directed information linked, not all of you see the same information. In other words, in the old days, you watched people got their stuff on BBC or TV or news, right? Everyone watched it. Therefore, everyone got, or the red newspapers, everyone got the same information. Now, because most of you get your information from those devices, you are individually targeted. In other words, every time you go to a news source, it looks at your cookies, look what you want. Even established news magazines won't have the same website for you as everyone else. Why? Because it's trying to what? Cater to your taste so you go back. Their AI, the algorithms of their site with the cookies and that will give you, knowing what you've consumed, looking at what you've consumed, looking at your behavior. Now, my God, they even know what coffee shop you go to. They know what clothes store you go to. They know everything you do. Why? Because you're bringing your frigging phone with you, and your frigging phone is telling them everywhere you're going, and they know where it is. So Google, what does Google do? Google or Apple sell that information to the companies, media companies, and these things, who then try to sell you stuff. Mass advertising is dead. Specific targeting advertisement is the new way to go. And because of that, they know everything about you. And because they want to keep your attention on you, they feed you information that you consume. You know what the danger of this is? Well, because most people are lazy. Most people don't want to really go search for things and go even to alternative news sites. Will not get VPNs, will not get blockers, will not try to mask themselves so they get access to different sources, will not use media sources that will give you different media perspective. Like there's, there's a 2 or 3 news services that rates the ideology spectrum of the news. That it will rate the different media sources from different, so you can see every story issue across ideological lines or the media narrative lines. Okay, how many people do that? Very few. Most of you will only consume what you get through your social media link text and your information sense. So you're easily manipulated. The media elites, the political elites know this, and they play this. They hold back information. Why do they do? Because right now, political life is permanent crisis management. All political, my God, a coalition government? Woo-hoo! A coalition government has to run by crisis management. Because, no, come on, why don't you? I did that whoo-hoo sound because anytime you have a cabinet government, everything is the deal behind the deal behind the deal, not the election. And what happens? You don't think the minority parties who can unseat the government is not always going to blackmail the majority, the dominant government, the prime minister's government? You don't think left and new third way is not constantly threatening to leave the coalition if they don't get what they want on certain issues? And why did the prime minister have to sacrifice 3 ministers to run in the Euro elections? That's even more scary. That he had to remove 3 ministers. That means they can't sit as ministers anymore because they're going to be going to Europe, right? Why did he do that? Was that really aimed at, was it desperation, or was it an attempt to eliminate threats to his political control? To what degree are ministers and things, when a minister cares more in that situation, what are you afraid of? You're afraid of the people in your own leadership party who make side deals. This is the difference between a presidential system and a prime minister system. A prime minister system a president is elected by the people and has a mandate. a period time of mandate. A prime minister is not, his only office is the elected office he's got into. His mandate is whatever the majority of his ability to keep a majority in parliament to support his government. And if his own leadership abandons him, he or she will lose her appointment power. So this is some aspects of the nature of the difference between cabinet government and executive government that is very important, and therefore you have to pay attention to this. And this is why crisis management has become the new thing, and particularly in what? In the media landscape in parliamentary democracies. This is the big thing. It is worse in parliamentary democracies. Because why? Because of the character of how governments are formed in those systems. Usually broad coalitions, and you can rig them. Any kind of parliamentary or governmental structure that requires coalitions are rigged systems. This is why the European Parliament was I think what's going to happen is that the European election is going to cause more, that you're not going to see a real change. Because what's happened is, yes, you elected a lot of parties, Eurosceptic parties, that got very high scores in every correspondence. In fact, it gets so bad that the French president decided to have a new election, a national election in France in July.
Belgium as well.
Belgium. I haven't heard about Belgium, but I heard about that. This means what? That probably means that you're going to maybe see a shift of government, right? Maybe not, because what can happen is using the fear of the right-wing, so-called right-wing takeover of Europe. And by the way, there's no such thing as the right. At the end of the day, the nature of how the EU Parliament is structured, the meta parties, it only moves slightly to the Eurosceptic. Okay, there was no real shift. Why? Because the EU Parliament is designed to prevent radical shifts. The system is designed to ensure that there will not be, when in a new election there's a shift, that it's impossible to allow an electoral shift to happen. It is perfectly designed so that the status quo is constantly maintained. And what will immediately happen, even with some radical parties who get in there, the first thing that will happen is the Euro permanent bureaucracy will reach out to these leaders of these parties and make deals. Offer them jobs. We'll give you guys, they'll offer them huge jobs, like 10 times the salary they'll ever achieve. I mean, because look at Tusk. Tusk was, it was more attractive for him to go to Brussels than to stay as prime minister, right? That's how. And when his German masters told him to go back to Poland, we need you back in Poland to do our bidding. Come on, why was he going to leave Brussels? It was perfectly safe for him. He was immune from prosecution. He was nice and safe, making 5 times the salary he would make in Poland. Why would he want to do this? Because he was basically, he lost his job. He was hoping to get the NATO defense agreement deal. That was probably going to happen. Either he or Sikorsky were probably looking at NATO. But the Germans insisted that he return to Poland. Because the Germans wanted removal of PIS at all costs. How do I know this? Because I have enough friends in the German system that tells me these things to this very day. The Germans were like furious. Who do you think owns your media? All your radio stations. Most of your, except for like big papers, no, even your big papers. Except, who owns the majority of Agora in stocks?
Germans.
Exactly. You understand that? The Europeanization of media means German media structure. This is not EU paranoia. This is not PIS paranoia or even Confederatia paranoia. This is simply, just go look at the public record. That is scary. Teflon is owned by an American company, which is fine. Discovery, which is owned by BlackRock, the biggest multinational, the biggest investment hedge fund there is. 70% of the funds of Discovery is owned by BlackRock. Now, what is this? It means a very important way that media can be manipulated, that it is manipulated. And it becomes a tool of political classes and political interests. So back to the problem, crisis management. As we talked about this. We talked about perceptions and threats, right? We did that. But this is something I really didn't hit on, the decision and advice. One of the things political leaders have to do is they either have to be able to decide, they have to make decisions, but usually most political leaders don't necessarily know everything. They have to, in other words, they rely on advice. Decisions require political actors engaged to seek advice from experts. And the danger here is the problem of the expert, right? One of the new problems is political actors tend to defer on important issues to experts, specialists. And this has increasingly happened in England. This happened in the last 10 years, 15 years across Europe. What has happened is scientific, non-political, non-partisan boards, intergovernmental boards or entities were created. Now this is very much true in England. The creation of these special intergovernmental governing boards, similar to the national banks, okay? Similar to like the national banks. National banks were created as a means to take the money, currency issues, away from the parliamentarians. Before the creation of central banks, the parliamentarians, in their controlling of the ministries, the Ministry of Treasury, controlled money supply. So around the turn of the 20th century, they decided to create central banks. Central banks are what? They are basically, they're appointed, you appoint, the presidents or prime ministers will appoint economists and banking experts on these boards of which have like 6-year terms, and they also design that, and often they're designed in a way, the board will have like 10, 15 people, and although the chief board will be maybe the leader, and it'll have the leading term, there'll be a chief commissioner or something like that, but the boards are designed so that you can't change them quickly. So even if you have that they're divided into like 3 6-year terms. Like the Congress, American Congress is divided, so that only 1/3 of any time there is a change, where you get to remove somebody and put new people in, you only get to maybe only change 1/3 or less. It depends on the structure of the system. Okay, you see what I mean by that? It's designed to prevent change, and these people will usually have no accountability. The only accountability is they get to be removed from office. They're experts. There's no parliamentary oversight over them. They can okay, maybe in America, the Fed has to go to Congress in order to get, go to hearings, give testimony. Congress can force them to give testimony, but doesn't have any real power to control the Fed rate, things like this. They can influence it, but they can't control it. Now, why is this important to understand? This happened now in England across not only that, but also energy policy, environmental building control. In other words, England radically moved many of the decision making on issues of education, culture, energy, housing market to these independent boards who are no longer under the control of Parliament. Rule of the expert. And during COVID, we saw this. The role of the medical clinicians, who technically were wrong, who often advocated policies and positions that they knew were false. Okay? This is another thing. But they were no way to account for them. Often because, why? Because they were given prerogative powers. Prerogative powers usually reserved either for the president or the crown in parliamentary systems, or through the prime minister. Executive officers, key executive prerogative were transferred to these commissions and boards. And now parliaments and legislative bodies who are elected by the people have no control or oversight over them. That's the new trend. So therefore, this is the danger. There's a difference from taking advice, getting advice from experts, than deferring to experts. Transferring political power from democratically elected legislatures and executives who are accountable to the people through the electoral process, and interagency boards who are appointed officials who have no accountability to the people, who are there only by their technocratic expertise. This is a kind of, now if we go back to the regime question, the regime that this kind of, these institutional structures, remember we said, but institutional structures, their character will also point to a regime type. Okay? You look at every political institution. Every institution, look how it's constructed, look how it's elected, look how it's structured, look how the mechanisms of accountability. You can decide whether something is democratic, oligarchic, aristocratic, monarchical, or despotic. And therefore, the interesting nature, back to the regime question, is that every political regime will have institutions. Sometimes they'll keep old regimes. But that regime, that institution will push a regime towards the direction of the principle governing that institution. So a lot of times what you have is a balancing act. Regimes have balancing acts. They will keep some institutions that are different from the regime. Going like the judiciary is clearly an aristocratic entity, but the jury is a democratic entity. Notice that the jury system is if you have a jury system where the juries come into being and they make the decision, and they're selected by lottery, by the voter base, that is a very democratic judicial system. But if the judges are there, the judges who decide what the law are, they're appointed for life, they're not elected, and they're not really accountable. This is very aristocratic, see? So you have the Anglo-American judicial system is a compromise between a democratic and an aristocratic model. The Roman law model that most European and most of the non-Anglo-Saxon world uses is an aristocratic model. There's no juries. Oh yeah, we have a jury, but it's not really a jury. It's one person pulled in to kind of be and he's usually that person is overridden by the judges and the legal experts, right? So therefore you don't have a true jury system. You have a judicial system where judges are they're not lifetime appointment. They either serve terms, they represent a class interest. Go reread again Montesquieu's discussion of book 11, chapter 6, about, it says Constitution of England, but it's not really about the Constitution of England, where he talks about the nature. Go look at a judicial system. A judicial system that is with the judges, the people who get to decide this, are they a permanent class? Yes. Who are they? Who appointed them? How they're selected? Are they real? Do they represent a class interest that is different from the people who are being charged or reviewed? Yes. You look at that's an aristocratic system. So therefore, you need to look at the institutions to understand the structure of what goes on here. And therefore, political leadership is working in those institutions. So, but the problem here is when you rely on experts, what happens here? The rise of modern bureaucracy brings institutionalization of experts, right? Specialized knowledge necessary for the functioning of principal decision makers. This is Weber's argument. Weber's classic, in fact, this is the reading from Weber that we have about bureaucracy. In the tool section, when we had the tool section about administration, I assigned a Weber reading. Why? Because Weber makes a very specific argument showing that bureaucracy is designed out of a need of rationalization of the system. And you need to have a situation where, because of the necessity of technical knowledge, political decision makers are going to have to be informed about this. But the danger is, and even Weber saw this, was that once you have a body with such power, they establish an interest, a permanent interest. And they will, like any body, they will preserve and protect their interests, advocate for their interest. The idea that the bureaucracy is a selfless entity that only exists for the good of the community and is doing everything selfless is the most naive and silly understanding of bureaucracies. Once you create a bureaucracy, the bureaucracy will do what? It will, if it's permanent and if it's structured a certain way, it will establish an interest and it will protect its interest. It will then agitate within the system to protect its interest. It will find allies in the system to work with to protect and advocate its interests. It will either make allies in the legislature or judiciary to challenge the executive, any authority from the executive that they don't like. And the fact that you create a bureaucracy that is a permanent or independent bureaucracy, that in other words, a new administration can't come in and simply fire everyone and replace them with loyalists. This is the idea of a permanent civil service, right? This creates the most dangerous of things, because this becomes what? A vested permanent interest that has no checks on it. So, what about the advisors? Where decision makers come in here? What one key problem is, especially a democratic regime, is who really should be making the decisions? Who should be making the ultimate decisions? Should it be the experts? Or should it be should it really be the experts? No. In a democracy, the people should be making decisions. Their representatives should be making decisions. The second you say, oh, no, sorry, that this is specialized knowledge and only the experts can do it, you're making an aristocratic claim, a non-democratic aristocratic claim. And you have to see that as for what it is. Now, Machiavelli says permanently, there's always the so-called, he famously speaks of the three minds. That there are three types of minds. You took any political actor. This is a famous chapter of Secretaries at the end of, and around book 20, in the later book chapters of the Prince. Now the Secretaries he talks about the three types of minds: ones that know on its own, ones that can know from others that inform him, and then the one who cannot either know on their own or through others. The last is the worst. The first is the best. But the problem then, even with the Machiavellian answer, is the second person is problematic. Why? You have to be you have to be able to judge the reliability of those who are informing you. If you don't know enough that you can judge the character or the ability of, you don't know on your own but rely on others, you're a prisoner to the others who may not know themselves or may have their own interests. So the second one is as bad as the third. Therefore, the nature of political rule is the ability to make judgment. Not necessarily know everything, but to be able to judge the character of the experts, to see their interests, to know when are they acting for their actually good of the community versus when they're acting for their own interests. The nature of political judgment is the key thing. And this is why the centrality of prudence, political prudence, is necessary. Judgment is necessary. And goes back to the problem of judgment that we talked about last week, of judgment. In fact, this is the whole aspect of crisis management. Now, I'm not going to go into the crisis-style leadership. We talked about that just generally. These are classic arguments. The classical model has, the micromanaging model, then the kind of what we call the goal-oriented model. This is the classical model. And then the less than classical model is the consensus leadership. We talked about that. This is more parliamentary. This is more European or corporatist in that sense. This is very German. The German model has always been a consensus-based model of class interest groups or interest groups. In fact, this was so essential that the Germans insisted when the creation of the EU happened that the policy deliberation model follow their tripartite model. That is what? You have your governmental interests, you have the economic interests, and then you have the labor and the social interests. And that you have these groups. For you to have any legislation, that all three groups must agree. You must have consensus, or a policy will not be allowed to be put forward. The tripartite model system therefore gives industry leaders, industry sectors, and economic sector a kind of veto against society, social and economic, and also we call labor and social interests, and also to the governmental interests. Likewise, governmental interests have the veto over social and economic interests, right? So what you have is this kind of consensus model. And the last model of deliberation is deliberative model, which looks at that in a certain way. Now, this is the famous outline of chapter prints that I don't require it in that sense, but it's useful to read in this sense. This is the structure of that of 12 through 14 the arms in the man. Chapters 15 to 20 talk about virtues of the prince, therefore the characteristic, things that are praise and blame. This is one of those chapters where he talks about character building. This is one of the things that if I had another course at this level, I would have a course on the prince for this purpose of teaching blame. How do we define characteristics? How do we look at leaders, their characteristics and their questions? And how do we judge? How do we judge people by their character? This is kind of political psychology and moral ethics, where we look at people by their character, and we can decide by their character, their behavior, the way they live their lives, the way they formulate their things. We can decide and evaluate their ability to make judgments and how they will act as a political. Now, the classic model for this was always Plutarch's Lives. Plutarch's famous Lives of Romans and Greeks, which he gave parallel lives of a Greek statesman, myth. It began with mythic, but then non-mythic characters in political history of Greece and Rome, and he would compare them to each other. And what every one of his stored lives was a type, a human political type, with certain characteristics like ambitious, prideful, courageous, cowardly. In other words, every single type every single one of the lives gave a type. And then also by giving the Roman example and the Greek example, he showed how different contexts would cause the same type to behave differently. In other words, one type would work. In other words, in the different contexts, these two types will not benefit or reward or operate in the same way. So therefore, by doing this is why the chapters on praise and blame, liberality, parsimonious, cruelty and pity, keeping faith and avoiding hatred and contempt. In fact, Machiavelli's lessons on avoiding hatred is essential. Now, whether to be loved or feared, that's the famous question, right? Is it better to be loved or feared? One of the most striking ironies of liberalism is that it rests on fear. The liberal structure ultimately needs fear as the motivation mechanism for it to establish the collective good, or the positive good that the public will seek. Without fear, there can be no law. Without fear, there can be no order. Fear is the essential element that is necessary, and that you must, and without fear, if there are people without fear, these are the most dangerous. There was recently, this week, there was a TV episode in America where they were showing a courtroom situation of this woman, a black woman, who just brutally murdered a 12-year-old child. Okay, and she was in the court, and she's just smiling at the judge, and the way you look at the picture of this, and the smiling nature, and that it was scary if you looked at it from the point of view. This is a class A sociopath, extremely dangerous. But if you looked at her, she looked like an innocent child. Okay, why is this important? Why am I giving that message? This is the danger of what you have to understand. This is why fear is so important. Fear. If you don't have fear, if you don't have a device to say, "Oh, that's danger," what will happen is that you will find yourself in situations where, I'm sorry, you'll be endangered and destroyed. Why hatred? I mean, it's nothing wrong with being feared, but you should never be hated. Why political leaders only get destroyed when they get hated? You know, if they have no power and they're hated, then then what happens is everyone will go after them. So avoiding contempt and hatred, that's the big problem. And then he talks about the last 25, 20 is prudence, and this is the example of this. Chapter 22 is about secretaries. He says, the question, again, he returns to fortresses. Every one of these chapters, 20 is about fortresses, whether they're useful or not. And and basically in all these chapters, these 6 chapters, in 20 to 25, Machiavelli lies to you. He wants to see if you've been paying attention. He will advocate what he earlier said you should not do, all through these chapters. So he's testing you, whether you've been paying attention, and then do you have good judgment or not. So fortresses useful or not. He's testing you about whether you've understood the discussion about fortresses. About how should you be esteemed? Should you seek to be esteemed? To understanding the relative merit of good virtues and vices. Secretaries chapter. This is testing whether you understand when do you need judgment. When is judgment essential to have? And when, like this, and flatterers. The flatterer chapter. Very important, because trust me, most political leaders and most powerful people, and what is he saying here is not only true about political leaders, but also any kind of leader. A management leader, a business leader will follow the same problems of this. About the flatterer, how to avoid them. Don't be surrounded by them. They will destroy you. And then why? And then chapter 24 is why the princes of Italy lost their kingdoms. In other words, why did political leaders? What causes leaders to lose control and lose their situation, lose power, and lose their nations? And then last is fortune. The question of fortune, how to handle fortune, fortune and how to control her. The infamous chapter that gets everyone in trouble when they read it. And then last but not least is 26, which is a weird chapter because its style is completely different. It goes from being the style completely changes to a more poetic exhortation, like a cheerleader. He goes from the style changes to a cheerleading advocating for the liberation of Italy. which seems to be very counter the tone and style of now, I argue there's a very good reason for that, and that there's a very perverse reason for that, is by if you look at what he advises you to do at the end of chapter 25, 26 is basically the orgiastic ecstasy of what happens after that. Okay, this is what he explicitly advises you to do, which he admits that it will not cause you. I mean, his advice to do this is actually bad advice, because early in that same chapter he will say anyone who does this will be miserable and will find themselves being ruined by it. So those are the weird check-ins of this. Is why I wanted to wrap up some of the things I didn't get a chance to do last week, because what is modern today's leadership today? This is chapter 24 to 26 of Lord. This is straightforward. What is the problem here? In democratic societies doesn't like leaders. You look at the idea for leaders is think it's undemocratic. There is, in other words, they have a dislike of leadership. Democratic societies dislike leaders. They'll look at leaders and they'll look at them as foreigners or outsiders or people interfering, and they'll see leaders or role of leaders or anything focusing on need of leaders as anti-democratic. The nature of the modern system is an aggregated system. From Hobbes, Locke, everyone on, the nature of the system of politics is an aggregation system. It looks at a collective aggregation of individual actors. Yes, you look at the individual, but the individual does not, you don't pay attention to the individual as the individual. You aggregate all the collective individuals together in a system. It's systemic. And therefore, to focus on the individual or the leader is to engage in subsystemic structures. You understand what I mean? That if we understand the social entity as the mere aggregation of collective interest in groups, therefore the nature of the political system is systemic. Go back to the infamous black boxes that I used, right? It's the structure of all these are, in other words, the system is not the action of any single one actor, but rather it is the systematic action of all the actors interacting with each other in a structured system. So therefore, to focus on leadership or individual leadership, you are engaging, you're not examining the structure, you're going underneath, you're subsystem. This is subsystem. You're looking at the individual part and giving to that individual part a very dominant controlling role that violates the very principles of systemic structures. The idea of a systemic model is that everything is, how the system works is how all the parts work. And that really no one part can really control the system. To focus on leadership argues, no, I'm sorry, yes, there's going to be parts, there are going to be individual parts, players, that are going to ultimately shape or reshape the system. Make or remake the system. They're going to be larger than life actors. Larger than system actors. Actors within the system that are able to transcend the system and make and reshape the system. In fact, Machiavelli hit on this in his famous chapter of, was it 4? The princes those who become princes through their own arms and virtue, right? He talks about the great captains, the four great captains, Moses, Theseus, Romulus, and Cyrus. And how these great leaders the only thing they need, their virtue is so excellent, but the only thing they need from fortune is the occasion. Without their virtue, they would not. Having the occasion without virtue would lead to ruin, and to have all their virtue but not the occasion would be vain. They wouldn't be able to accomplish anything. They have a timing problem. The great leaders who have all these great skills and capacities, and therefore there are going to be people who are, because of their skills and their abilities, are at the right moment of time in a society or history that they are able to shape it by their actions, by their choices. And this is the importance of leaders. This is why we pay attention to this. And then therefore, this is why democratic society both dislikes them but also needs them. Here's another problem. I hate to say it, mass organizations do not accomplish anything. Things without leaders in them, the idea that we can have a mass movement of society and everything raves up, would rise up and then therefore cause for change. This never accomplishes anything. Any successful system of change or revolution always is driven by a leadership cadre. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian, you point me to any successful revolution. Or even, you can even point to failed revolutions. But if you look at the failed revolutions, they were mostly leaderless. And not having or if there is a leader, the leader is only one or two people that had no subordinate cliques of people under them that they could organize and execute the masses and the larger society to accomplish. In other words, you just can't have a single leader by himself. You need a leader who has a number of assistants in a cadre that act as act as his intermediaries to the masses. You need for better word, is a nomenclatura, or a cadre of people who will do what for you? That they will be they will repeat your message, execute your things, but organize the masses. You cannot large-scale mass. In fact, large-scale mass society necessitates leaders. The larger the structure of the social networks, the need of leaders are increased. Why? Because there needs to be organization. In other words, the mass by itself could not do it. It would just be, in other words, how could you participate? Having a group of 50,000 people collectively make decisions? Do you know what a monstrous disaster that would be? Complete monstrous disaster that will be in terms of accomplishing anything? It will not accomplish anything. It would always be a situation where they would fail in a sense. They would fail in terms of the likely outcome of what happened, because they wouldn't be able to collectively do it. Look how, if you had 50,000 people trying to discuss something, just imagine that. It'd be virtually impossible to have short meetings. It'd take days, weeks to make any decision. And the nature of human beings is not every human person is going to equally deliberate. Not everyone in the group are going to execute or carry out the desire to take part in public activities. They're not going to want to speak in front of the crowd. So in other words, those who will stand up and speak in front of a crowd, a mass, to present the position, is going to be a self-selecting body of the people who have the desire, capacity. No, heck, They have to have the desire to do it, or they have to have the need to do it, and they have to have the willingness to do things. Now, of course, this is
about this one.
Oh.
Today's 14.
Oh, 14. Here.
I'd rather take this one.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I apologize. I gave you the wrong one. Oops. Oops. So, in other words, you can't. The second point on there, you can't avoid leaders. You can't escape the need for leaders because the structure of large-scale societies, the masses by themselves cannot coordinate. You automatically get them. This is the famous iron law of oligarchy. Moscow's, or you can say Moscow's iron law of oligarchy, that in any large-scale society, to have it effectively run, the limits of participation, the limited character of who can participate, and to having effective organization of it, what you'll have is the larger the society, the fewer the people who will be running it. That's one aspect of it. That's the organizational structure. Then there's Rousseau's. I mean, this is even though Rousseau wrote this before Moscow, hundreds of years before Moscow. Rousseau then argued the next thing: the perception of individual power. The larger the scale of the society, the less powerful any individual feels. In other words, the relative power of any individual, regardless of their skills, just the nature of their voice, right, is merely 1 divided by the number of the size of the community in question. So 1 divided by n. So what happens if you're in a society of 100,000? That's 1/100,000, right? But then if a society moves from 100,000 to 1 million. So what happened to your relative power? Did it increase or decrease? It massively decreased. That this is the individual's perception of their power. And it is the relative merit of their power in terms of their influence in the system as a larger part of the whole. So therefore, the perceptions of powerlessness. Mass-scale society produces aspects that individuals feel ultimately powerless and helpless within the system, and are therefore subject to the forces in society. This is what Tocqueville talked about as the danger of individualism, and this is what Durkheim talked about as athame, this sense of isolation and aloneness in this sense. So, therefore, this is due, like I said, need for these. This is due to what? The problem of the largeness of organizations and societies, and this is a question that not everyone is equal capacity to act or to do. In other words, not everyone is going to have the same capacities to act and to do. In fact, larger scale societies, what's going to happen is you're going to have there's not going to be every individual is not the lie that every individual is equal. No, every individual is not equal to each other. They have different abilities, different capacities, different desires, different wants. And from their desires and wants will lead to what? Different ends and different goals. And that these different goals will produce different conditions and ability, status and levels and situations. And their ability to succeed and failure, to succeed or fail achieving what they want and goals, will be determined to their status of being equal or not equal to each other. So then, therefore, another thing, the next step, leaders are also need occasions or times to act. In other words, just having this goes back all the way to the famous chapter 4 of the Prince. The problem is you could be the greatest leader with the greatest skills, but if there's not an occasion for you to act, sorry, it ain't going to happen. By the way, this is why political leaders like war, like a crisis, Because crises are, in other words, what is that line? Never let it, this is what David Axelrod jokingly said, never let a good, no, after class, never let a good crisis go to waste, because this becomes an opportunity to show your leadership, your skills. In other words, crises are occasions to act. Therefore, a president who had never in a great occasion, but some people argue you can make, in other words, our occasions are really occasions outside of your, and I think this is why some people create permanent crisis. I think some leaders pick personal crisis trying to manufacture their own greatness, trying to manipulate fortune. So what? There is a problem of chance. Something happened. That's one thing. Sometimes there are occasions, but sometimes there's no occasions. This is why crises offer opportunities that normal times don't. This is what leads to the danger of some political actors liking crisis. The danger of crisis is that crisis. Okay. Now here's the problem. One of the important thinkers of the 20th century, the German thinker Carl Schmitt, talked about the need for the exception. But the exception was not, it was something that was done in crisis or extreme cases of emergency. What we've done in the 20th century is the normalization of the exception. We have taken the thing that the action of exceptional activity, what should be done in the time of the exception or emergency, and what we've done is routinized it. We've made it the everyday, the normal strategy. And this is pathological. This is the normalization of the exception, the normalization of the crisis, is a pathological behavior structure. Politically pathological. Now, therefore, this is the ending point. Leaders need to resist the times they're in and prepare for the future. This is another crisis. I'm going to kind of end on that point, not end, but it goes back to here. But I want to end on that point because this is the problem that Machiavelli and also Lord wants to highlight. That the leader must not only think of the now. Too many political decision makers only think of the now, the current. It is their job is like their, and by the way, crisis management focuses, see the danger of focusing on crisis is often that it's an existential die or not die moment, right? So you're focused on the now, right? You're focused on the, to focus on the now is a problem. Now, sometimes it's necessary. In a crisis, it's essential because the addressing the now is the thing whether that the political system will survive or not survive, right? The now is something that you will focus on. But that's not leadership. That's just surviving. Yes, survivors. In other words, the goal of real leadership is not only thinking about how do I survive at this moment, but towards what end I want to bring this survival towards. To merely survive so that everything is worse off, this is not leadership. To merely have a mechanism of survival that the quality of life of everyone is going to be miserable, that's not leadership. That's something else. That's madness. The goal, even in crisis management, needs to think beyond the crisis towards. Now, this is the great leaders. The great leaders don't only think about the crisis, but they think of what the crisis allows them to deliver. What is the crisis is a means to an end, not an end in itself. The crisis allows the occasion to accomplish your long-term strategic goals. Remember, we distinguish between short-term tactical goals, the winning of the situation and winning of the battle, the winning of the thing, versus strategic goals, which are long-term. What are your long-term goals? What are the long-term things you're trying to achieve? The question is, are those long-term goals reasonable? Are they even doable? Does the society want them? That takes us back to last week's discussion point, right? This is the need. Takes us back to the tools. You're going to have to be able to judge the society, what it wants, but also what communicate things to society. Effective leadership requires communication to what? If the society isn't ready for that, then you can't start delivering them. If the society at large is not ready, then you can't force them to do it. You're going to have to communicate the message to them. You're going to have to get them, in other words, we want, even non-democratic governments prefer to have consensual group. In other words, it's easier to govern a people when they agree to it than to govern a people who don't agree to it. The more the society you're ruling doesn't agree with what you're doing, the more coercion you will need to accomplish what you need. In other words, it doesn't matter if it's a free. Now, this is true for every society. Even aristocratic societies, democratic societies, oligarchic, and even the Soviet friggin' Union. Even they had to rely on consent. There were limits to what they could even do, because they needed to. Now, of course, they didn't have to care what the larger society did, but they had to take care and take of the interest of the large apparatchik class that existed. And that if you created a situation where they had conflicting interests, you couldn't make any policies. So therefore, you had to look at you have to communicate things. You need to communicate. You need to put your message out. You need to convince people, persuade, maybe even sometimes lie, distort to get things in other words, sometimes you need lying to get what you want. If you think it's the real good, people will lie or withhold the truth. This is both good and bad political systems do this. So we're going to look at the question here is that leaders need to what? Resist that temptation, look towards the future and not the mere present. And they should never forget or ignore the past, as the past is the prologue to the future. In other words, the past, every society, the past is the past of their history, their identity, their things, play essential. They are the landmark symbols of a people's consciousness of themselves, their identity of themselves. And unless you're going to destroy their identity and create a new identity, you need to, if you want to basically change everything radically, you need to have them to forget their past. You need them to be ignorant of their identity. You need them to be completely ignorant. You need them to be isolated individuals who have no identity, in other words, no group loyalties, no group structures. They're so isolated and alone that they're easily manipulable, and because they're isolated individuals, they're easily, particularly when they're subdivided into their own individual wills. In other words, everyone is their own individual person and identity of that sense. And then you create artificial group structures and artificial entities in order to create more division, to break the system up, to isolate and individualize again. Then what do? You have a completely empty mold that you can impose an order on. In other words, if you destroy the memories, destroy the identity, destroy the past, then what happens? It is going to be the political system, whoever the leaders, the structures of the system of control will be able to give you. We'll give you one. We'll give lies to you. New myths, new structures, new beliefs. And because there's nothing of the old, remember, there's nothing to resist it. So therefore, this is why a good political leader should never forget the past in that sense. Because I want to go back to that famous line from Burke, that yes, he's, at one level he rejects the social contract, yes, that every society is a social contract. But it's not of the present, it is a contract with what? The living and the dead and those yet to be born. That yes, society is a contract, but it's not a contract between the merely present. It is between the living and the dead and those who are yet to be born. And therefore, this is within the context of a given people, their identity and their structures. And that political leadership needs to take these things into consideration, and if it doesn't, well, that is not leadership, that is the absence of it. So we end our class with that theme, and I will hope you guys good exam times coming up.